believe have a quorum, so we can begin. Good afternoon. This is Charlie Zelli, Chair of the Met Council, and this is the Committee of the Whole regular meeting, June 16th, 2021. And before we start, I will subject you to my usual preface that this is, in fact, a virtual meeting by virtue of the governor's peacetime emergency order. Unfortunately, we are unable to take public comments, but, and this being a committee of the whole, that's a rare element anyway, but if anybody who is a member of public tuning in remotely, please feel free to send any questions or comments by email to public.info@metc.state.mn.us, and we'll respond to your comments in a timely manner. In order to establish a quorum, we will now call the meeting to order, and I believe Bridget is here to call the roll.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
All right. Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson. Atlas Ingebretson. Barber.
Here.
Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Ferguson.
Here.
Fredson. Fredson. Gonzalez. Gonzalez. Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren. Lindstrom.
Here.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Zirin.
Zirin is present.
Chair Zelli.
I'm here, and I believe Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson has arrived. I get the advantage of having a name that starts with Z. That really gives me an advantage. I think we're on to approval of the agenda, and unless there's any question or comment, I will assume the agenda is approved, which gets us to the minutes from May 5th, 2021. That was the regular meeting of the Committee of the Whole. Is there a motion and a second to approve?
Vento moves approval.
Thank you. Second?
Second, Atlas Ingebretson.
Thank you, Linnea. Any comments, corrections? All right, hearing none. Bridget, please call the roll.
All right, Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson.
Aye.
Barber.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Ferguson.
Aye.
Fredson. Fredson.
Bridget?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Gonzalez. Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren. Lilligren. Lindstrom.
Aye.
Sterner. Sterner. Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Zirin.
Zirin's aye.
Chair Zelli.
That's aye. So the minutes are approved. Great. Well, thanks everybody. And I've been looking forward to this presentation today. We're going to hear about the Healthy Community Planning Project, which is an important element of our whole planning composite. And by the pre-read, that is a lofty PowerPoint with a lot of information. And I'm interested in hearing from the three presenters, Angela Torres, Eric Wojchik, and Jerome Banner. And I'm not sure who's leading off, but Angela, is that you?
It is. Thank you, Chair Zelli.
Lovely.
Uh,
Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angela Torres, Manager of Local Planning Assistance. I'll be giving a super brief introduction today just to tie in the larger presentation to our previous work on the Comprehensive Plan Composite, which we presented to you in April. Then I'll turn the discussion over to Jerome Benner and Eric Wojchik to introduce our partners on the Healthy Community Planning Project. Greg, next slide, please. Thank you so much. Here's where the comprehensive plan review process stands today. I kind of always like to start here to kind of frame it for us. Um, the numbers have shifted ever so slightly, but the further along we get in the review process, the minor changes really mean a lot because we have so many fewer plans left on our desks. So we still have 168 comprehensive plans that represent 187 jurisdictions. We're still expecting 168 of those plans to come in, and we've received 163 of them. We have two plans that are currently in process, Ham Lake and North Oaks, with us, and then 17 are considered incomplete, and then we're awaiting a response by the local government. We're providing assistance to them along the way as well. Right now, we have 5 plans that are complete, considered complete, and they are scheduled for committee review, and you'll be seeing them soon at the CDC meetings. So that's actually a big number for us. 5 plans at the moment is a lot for us to kind of tick off as complete. 139 plans have been authorized by the council to date. So there are just a few remaining outstanding plans, and we continue to work with those communities to receive them. And I share this again with you so that we know, that we're continuing to make incremental progress on these, and a little bit of progress at this time is a big deal. So next slide, Greg, please. You might remember that when I was here before, we had a lot of information to share. This was the agenda from our April 7th Committee of the Whole meeting. I talked ever so briefly about some of the components of the comprehensive plans that communities were including that weren't required, but definitely have an impact on the built environment, our communities, and our neighbors. And today the focus is on public health. I think you'll be able to see the connections to the Council's land use policies and some of the research that will be discussed today. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in April, the work on the comp plan analysis continues. Not only research components to continue along with the land use analysis, but also engagement with local governments. We're currently hosting a series of focus groups with local planning staff to talk about the comprehensive plan process, what went well, and how we can work on process improvements for unbelievably the next round of comprehensive plans. We're working to identify and provide resources to local governments on plan implementation, as well as working on a preparation for some of the work on the next regional development guide. So all of those projects line up completely with the comprehensive plans that we've already completed, you've already seen, you've already reviewed. So that's all I'm going to say for today. I'm going to turn it over to Eric Wojchik to do a little bit more framing around the presentation, and then he'll introduce the rest of his partners. Eric.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. I hope you can all hear me okay. Next slide, please. Great. You're going to hear quite a few different voices today, which is a sign of a true collaborative effort on this project, and that's super exciting. I'm not going to speak for too long. I'm really here to just introduce the Met Council team that worked on this project and do some high-level framing. So my name is Eric Wojchik. I'm a planning analyst in local planning assistance and community development at the council. And I was part of a team of 3 from the Met Council that worked on this project. My project partners at Met Council were Jerome Benner, senior planner, and Caitlin Shampoo, associate planner. They are also were critical to the success of this project. Next slide, please. So today we're going to hear from the project team from the Public Health Law Center. They're going to give you lots of excellent information, and they are truly dynamic speakers, so don't be put off by the length of the presentation. They will keep you interested and engaged, I promise, because we've heard this presentation previously at a Lunch and Learn, and it was very successful. They're going to be covering the project overview, the methodology and quantitative analysis. They're only going to focus on 2 of the 11 indicators that we looked at, and then we're going to have time at the end for discussion and questions. Next slide, please. So you might be asking yourself, well, what does health have to do with what our responsibilities are here at the council? As we know, we are becoming much more, from a policy perspective, much more engaged in the intersectionality of many different topic areas policy-wise. So we have our Thrive outcomes here, which we're all very familiar with. But really health, there's a through line through all of these with health. And for a lot of communities, what we're finding is that health is an off-ramp to accessing some of these other issues. As many of you know, I work a lot in sustainability and in climate resilience. And for a lot of communities, health is the avenue for achieving some of those outcomes. So it was really important for us to work with partners at the Minnesota Department of Health and the Public Health Law Center to really get a sense of what communities have committed to within their comprehensive plans related to health indicators and outcomes. Next slide, please. I'm going to pass it over to Jerome Benner, and he'll frame out the rest of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Can everyone hear me okay? Wonderful. Mr. Chair, council members, my name is Jerome Benner, as mentioned, Senior Planner and Local Planning Assistance. And the questions that you have in front of you on the screen here are some questions to keep in mind as you kind of take in this information and understand how it applies to our work, what we do here at the council, and also for our community at large. So some of the things to keep in mind are, what are some themes do you see in your work that are different, work with different communities that you do not see here? What are some opportunities or challenges that you see with implementing some of the themes that you're going to see here in a moment? And how might some of these themes influence future planning processes? Keep these in mind throughout the project, and we'll also revert back to them toward the end. Next slide, please. And to kind of give you an idea, council members, on how we got here to this point today. So over the past year, the Metropolitan Council staff has been working in partnership with the Minnesota Department of Health and the Public Health Law Center to learn about how communities in the region are addressing public health in their comprehensive plans. The team reviewed 49 comp plans and created 11 public health indicators as a way to frame our research. Various topics ranging from climate resiliency to healthy food access to physical activity and multimodal transportation alternatives were explored, among several others. Metropolitan Council staff acted in an advisory capacity by providing guidance on how this work could be best utilized to help influence healthy planning policies in the communities we serve. Today, you'll be hearing from 3 of the planning research assistants on this project from the Public Health Law Center: Anna Crouch, Matthew Gabe, and Doug Benson. Next slide, please. And here are some goals that we kind of framed up to help us, again, kind of align our work and kind of give us somewhat of a mission to work toward. The intent is to align project framework, process, and outputs to support cross-cutting goals of partner agencies. Some of these goals are to elevate priority public health challenges, support community-to-community learning, and grow the network of allied professionals, showcase local strategy and policy examples that advance priority public health issues, build from foundational partner agency work in this area, and lastly, identify opportunities where partner agencies can provide coordinated technical assistance. And with that, next slide, please. I'd like to pass it over to Anna, Matthew, and Doug. Thank you for your time.
Hello all, and thank you, Jerome and Eric, for the wonderful introduction. I am Anna Crouch. I am one of the planning research assistants at Public Health Law Center. And so we're just gonna, and I, along with Matthew and Doug, are gonna present to you some of the findings we found. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We just want to say right off the bat that this project is funded by the statewide health improvement partnership at the Minnesota Department of Health. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that our core team included members from the statewide health improvement partnership, as well as Met Council, of course, and us, the Public Health Law Center. On the next slide, if you go to the next slide, please, you can see some of us. Again, so Doug, myself, and Matthew are here on the call today. Sarah Paulus, unfortunately, is moving across country, so she couldn't be available. But if we just dive in onto the next slide, you'll see an agenda, which is basically something that Eric has gone over. I'm sorry, my internet is a little funky right now, so if there are any issues, please let me know. But what we're looking at are these 11 indicators and plans, and today we'll be focusing again on healthy food access and recreation opportunities. Next slide, please. All right, so to dive in a little bit to some of the methodology and quantitative analysis, we can go to the next slide. Here is a brief overview of our methodology. First was the preparation phase. So in this phase, we chose and identified those 11 indicators you saw on the previous slide. And then, of course, we also chose plans out of the 106 plans that were turned in by April 2020, we were able to choose 49 plans across different geographies, as well as different ship statuses. We then went into the reviewing the plan portion. In this portion, to get as many eyes on these plans as possible, we first looked at an individual review of the plans. So each research assistant would look at the plan individually and score them. And then we would come together to do a partner review just to make sure there wasn't anything we missed. In our third phase of analysis, we did the same thing, really trying to get as many eyes on our ideas as possible. So looking at themes across themes and indicators across plans individually and then as a partner, and then creating memos of these indicators, as well as the slides that you're going to see today. Next slide, please. So here are some of the quantitative pieces of information that we came up with. You can see that across these 11 indicators, there's a variety of amount of plans that actually just included the indicator at all, from 31% all the way up to 100%. And if I think you click on the next slide, you should see here are our two indicators that we're going to be talking to you about today. Food access, as you can see, about 2/3 of plans talked about that, whereas almost 100% of the plans we reviewed talked about recreation. And we'll get into a little bit about why we think that might be happening when we dive into the meat of our presentation. Next slide, please. We also looked at overall indicator strength. So not just whether this indicator was present, but whether how strongly it was present. If it was just a word, just popped up, or if it was present and included goals and policies, was our level 3. And if our strongest level of strength was level 4, which meant that the indicator was present, it included goals and policies, and it also dedicated funding and resources. And again, next slide, you should be able to see the two plans we have, the two indicators, we have highlighted are the ones going to talk about today. And you can see the differences in how strength is spread out across the plans. Next slide, please. And with that, I get to pass it over to Matthew Gabb. And he will talk a little bit about healthy food access.
Thank you so much, Anna. I really appreciate you walking through all that with us. If you can go to the next slide. So when we were reviewing the plans, as Anna was just talking about for food access, we were thinking about food from kind of a two-pronged viewpoint. So first, looking at it from the local food production standpoint. And as you can see in the more descriptive text below the main question, this is things like urban and residential agriculture and community gardens, urban orchards, things that often come to mind when we think about food access and local production. And then we were also thinking about healthy food retail. So grocery stores, food shelves, farmers markets, mobile markets, CSAs, drive-thrus, all those things, all those access points that folks use to purchase food and then consume it later. And beyond those two tangible ideas, we were also thinking at a higher level, looking at food deserts and food resources and food insecurity, and how are communities in the metro incorporating those larger concepts, not just into their food access planning for those that incorporated it, but potentially into their wider comprehensive plans, in their housing sections when they're talking about transportation and things like that. Next slide, please. And a lot of those questions that we were thinking about when looking at food access, of course, came directly from the Thrive MSP 2040 outcomes and principles that Eric kind of reminded of us at the beginning of this. So this is, of course, looking at equity concerns and health disparities. We are the Public Health Law Center, so we're making sure to be looking at those. And then, of course, the livability of neighborhoods, so that walkability and access aspect, and thinking about transportation and how folks are able to get to food. And then, of course, back on the production side, looking at sustainable food growth, and then also consumption and thinking about food waste and how we're disposing of, the food and the byproducts of the food that we're eating. And of course, as you might remember from those bar charts that Anna was going through, of course, we saw patterns amongst all 11 indicators of, if something is required by Met Council, such as things around housing, we see 100% of the 49 plans incorporating it, but things that aren't necessarily required at this time for the comprehensive planning processes, such as food access, where we only see around 2/3 of communities incorporating it into their plans. Next slide. And once again, you can kind of see the breakdown on that level 1 through 4. Again, that level 1 meaning that it's not incorporated, and then 2, 3, and 4 being kind of how thoroughly going along that scale food access goals and policies and resources are part of the comprehensive planning in our communities. And then on the far right of the bar chart, I just mentioned the equity piece and looking at health disparities, and this. That 50% in that blue hatched bar is, we looked in level 3 and 4 communities, we wanted to see how they were incorporating equity and grounding their goals and policies specifically in equity language. Beyond just equity rhetoric that any community can talk about, how is it being incorporated into the actual policies and goals that these communities are planning with? And we can see in food access that of the 20 level 3 and 4 communities, half of them are grounding their food access planning within this equity language. Next slide, please. So as Anna mentioned, we went through and looked for themes kind of based on different groupings of the 49 plans. So the first grouping, of course, was just across the entire metro. What are things that we're seeing universally in the urban core, in the suburbs, and rural areas across all 7 counties? And today we're not going to get into every single theme that we found in every single grouping, because we could be here for 6 hours, and I want to make sure folks can enjoy their summer day. But we're just going to highlight some examples. And of course, we do have those memos and that longer form stuff for anyone who does potentially want to get into the weeds and read more about all of the themes and all of the communities that we found to be really exemplary around them. But you can see on here the themes that we saw universally. And then on the right, we'll highlight one of those, the interesting approaches. So what are maybe one or two communities doing that all the reviewers felt was really a model that could serve for other communities, not just across the metro, but across Minnesota, of ways to really creatively plan for improving food access. So if you could go to the next slide. And here we're just going to highlight one of those universal, metro-wide themes that we found, and that's looking at healthy food retail, and making it easier for residents in the metro to reach places where they can, purchase healthy food and be able to afford to do so. So two examples are Columbia Heights, which is looking at development patterns and specifically focusing on, encouraging and planning for, over the next 20 years, development patterns that decrease the distance between households and healthy food retail options. And then in Minneapolis, they are looking, at existing retail. So beyond, it's very expensive, of course, to build a new grocery store. So looking at, existing corner stores, convenience shops and things, and providing financial and technical support for, expansion or equipment upgrades and the like, so that the retail stores that residents are already frequenting and shopping at they can just still continue to go those, but then also have additional access to healthy food. You can go to the next slide. One of the interesting approaches that we saw across the metro that we wanted to highlight was in Maplewood. So many communities talked about transportation and how are people getting to their food sources in the first place. And Maplewood is doing a really interesting thing where they are doing a sidewalk analysis and looking at the gaps in their sidewalk and trail network, specifically focusing on food stores, hunger relief programs, farmers markets, and community gardens, and making sure that any new development near those those food sources has a complete sidewalk and trail network so that not just drivers can safely access these sources of food, but also pedestrians and cyclists as well. And no matter what mode you're using, you can safely get to healthy food. Next slide, please. So these are the themes that we saw when we were looking at the groupings within the level 2, 3, and 4. So again, how thoroughly plans were incorporating policies and also dedicating resources to planning for healthy food access. And today we're just going to look at some of these level 3 and 4 communities that we thought are doing really great work that can really serve as a model in technical assistance and when thinking about future planning processes. So we go to the next slide. So in our level 3 communities, and these are the communities that have goals and policies but might not always have the ability to dedicate specific resources to them, we see things like mobile food distribution being leveraged as a strategy, kind of like with Minneapolis, to ensure that food can quickly and easily get to folks without having to put in a bunch of infrastructure, because people need to eat today and not, in 5 years when a grocery store is built. Columbia Heights, for example, returning to our, when we were talking about equity language, explicitly is planning for having mobile food markets and mobile food pantries to, quote, bring food closer to under-resourced consumers. So again, it's that grounding of policy in equity language when planning around food access. And we also see, for example, the support for mobile food distribution in places like Eden Prairie, which is looking at prepared meals that have mobile distribution, and Shakopee, which is specifically looking at mobile farmers markets. If you could go to the next slide. So we also wanted to make sure to give an example of how we were differentiating between level 3 and 4 communities. And one thing we saw was urban agriculture ordinances we see across both level 3 and level 4 communities. The difference between a level 3 urban agriculture ordinance plan and a level 4 is, again, that dedicated resources and funding. So, for example, looking at a level 3 community, Belle Plaine uses the language around, encouraging backyard gardening and community gardens on public property and expanding the range of allowable urban and residential farming activities. Minneapolis, one of our level 4 communities, on the other hand, has specifically, both Minneapolis and Burnsville, as you can see on this slide, have specifically cited zoning district standards and implementation that they're looking at around urban agriculture and local food production. And Minneapolis, additionally, is looking at specific funding for infrastructure such as things for extending the growing season, greenhouses and things like that, as well as resources for on-site processing. So, some of the cottage food industries, your jams and your jellies you might see at the farmer's market and things like that. You can go to the next slide. So a theme that we saw common across level 4 communities was food security assessments and making sure to get the data on food access and food insecurity. So both St. Louis Park and Osseo in Hennepin County, both are planning to have food security assessments or participate in a regional food security assessment. And this is, not only to know where are food stores and what does food insecurity look like in our community, to then know where are the gaps and where, with potentially limited resources, can we focus interventions to make sure that they are as effective as they can be. So you can go to the next slide. So I'm quickly going to talk about the themes we found, amongst the community designations, so looking at our rural, suburban, and urban communities, and what we saw common among those very specific contexts in the metro. So you can go to the next slide. So our rural communities, of course, is where a lot of our local farmers are and where a lot of our local agriculture is occurring. So places like Belle Plaine and Corcoran have a common goal of preserving agricultural land and looking at development patterns and the urban growth areas to make sure that while the communities are still allowing development and growth, that they're not encroaching on too much agricultural land and then losing losing just through development local farmers. So really encouraging that ag land preservation. Next slide. And our suburban communities are really looking to leverage existing programs and creating partnerships with those in order to not have duplicative efforts or reinvent the wheel and make sure to make good use of the work that's already being done. So Burnsville, for example, has specific strategies to coordinate with the school district, entertainment venues, and the YMCA and other sites to create those as spaces to increase access to healthy food without having to, again, bring in new infrastructure that's costly and making sure to leverage these. And we see this in places like Shakopee and Plymouth as well. And Shakopee specifically is, just like Burnsville, focusing on schools and making sure to look at childhood hunger. You can go to the next slide. And then in our urban communities, and this I think is a really good example showing of how our communities recognize that the food system does not exist in a vacuum just within city boundaries. So communities like Columbia Heights and St. Anthony Village are really looking to improve access to farmers markets and CSA drop-off sites for their residents. And for those who might not be as familiar, CSAs, or community-supported agriculture, both those and farmers markets are ways to directly purchase food from a farmer. So you don't have a middleman, or you don't have to go to a grocery store. You can see your farmer and know what you're getting and know where it's grown. And so Columbia Heights and St. Anthony Village are putting in strategies and policies to really increase that access. So that not only improves access to healthy food for the residents in those communities, but also creates a more stable and larger customer base for the farmers in some of the rural communities here in the metro. You can go to the next slide. And we're not going to dig deep into any specific examples around these, but I wanted to return again to this equity language and this grounding in equity that a lot of our communities are using when they're talking about food access. And some of the themes we saw in that equity language was, just at least making sure to acknowledge the current food system inequities so that we know, what is it? Where are the gaps? Again, kind of with those food security assessments, where are those gaps that we're trying to tackle here? And then, of course, the health disparities, going back to the, our Thrive MSP outcomes as well. And then acknowledging the role that income and income inequality play in food access and making sure that those concepts are also being centered when we're thinking about food to, again, make sure our interventions are as effective and impactful as they can be. And if you go to the next slide, and I will pass it back to Anna. And oh yes, and these are just, again, just a reminder of the questions we're thinking about, because I know throwing a lot at folks, so just to kind of reground in these questions about, future planning processes and the opportunities and challenges we're seeing in these themes. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and I will pass it back over to Anna, and she will talk to our other indicator that we're highlighting today, recreation.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much. And I'm going to keep my camera off just because I know that there have been some lagging issues with my internet. But that's okay, because hopefully none of the jokes that I make during this presentation will require any facial expressions. So next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about recreation opportunities, we looked at if the community is planning for access to these public recreational opportunities, including access to trails, other forms of recreation like parks, and making sure that these parks and trails are a part of the access network. We also looked at things like culturally appropriate programming and changing of recreation opportunities as communities change, as well as some more innovative things like dial ride to allow people to have to get to their recreation a little easier. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit about why recreation opportunities matter and how they're connected to the Thrive 2040 goals, we really looked at how recreation can enhance the livability of neighborhoods by supporting accessible recreation as well as transportation, and of course how it encourages equity by creating recreation opportunities for all members of the community, regardless of age, ability, or income. Looking at some Met Council requirements, we know that there is a regional parks policy plan for the Met Council. And so while that may not directly connect to all of these other individual communities, it does encourage communities to create their own planning around recreation opportunities. Next slide. And so you can see from this table, hopefully, that the chart of how you can see how the levels are distributed here slightly differently from Matthew's discussion of food access, with a lot more communities really really in that level 3 and 4 zone, and many fewer communities in level 1. And you can also see, returning to that equity language, that 70% of plans that discussed, that included goals and policies for recreation, also couched those goals and policies in the language of equity in some way, which is exciting to see. Next slide, please. So to come back in, we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these overall themes. Again, to echo Matthew, these themes, we're not going to be able to talk about all of these themes, but I do in particular have some of these interesting approaches are near and dear to my heart. So if you want to talk about them during our question and discussion section, I'd be happy to do that. But we'll stick with these two for now. Next slide, please. So looking at our first overall theme, we saw this opportunity for parkland dedication. And really what this does is you can do it either through land dedication or fees and funding. So for example, New Hope has established a park dedication fee back in 2003, which allows developments to pay money, and that money will go to park projects as well as new parks. Lake Elmo is actually putting that into, is hoping to put that into their ordinances or their development review process to enhance their green network. And Newport is using its park dedication fee to require future developments and redevelopments to incorporate new parks and trails, as well as just sidewalk connections. And then last but not least, Denmark Township is requiring the dedication of park or open space land or cash in lieu of it. Next slide, please. Going into the one interesting approach I chose, and I think this is an important one because it might not feel like it right now, but Minnesota is a pretty cold place for part of the year. And it was interesting to us that really only Plymouth, to our knowledge, discussed snow removal on trails to make sure that this trail infrastructure that communities may spend a lot of money on is accessible for all during even the colder half of the year. So Plymouth is trying to make sure that snow is removed from designated trails and sidewalks based on city council approved criteria. Next slide, please. So now kind of going into the ranking themes, we'll talk about a couple of these as well, primarily for level 3 and level 4. Next slide, please. So looking at our level 3 theme, one really important one that we saw that we really wanted to highlight was we saw level 3 communities creating strategies for long-term system maintenance through Adopt a Park programs like Eden Prairie, who is involving civic organizations, social clubs, faith-based organizations in making sure that they're adopting a park and volunteering to keep it maintained. Or on the other side, there's Plymouth, which is establishing a hierarchy of trails and sidewalks that they use to decide where maintenance needs to happen most immediately. Next slide, please. Looking at a level 4 approach, we saw a lot of communities, not just in level 4, but across urban as well as some level 3 communities, trying to partner with local school districts. And this is an important strategy to be able to increase the coordination between different groups, as well as avoiding the duplication of work. Oftentimes, students are the people who use recreation the most. So Inver Grove Heights and Brooklyn Center are looking for opportunities to partner with local school districts, as well as occasionally the private sector. Next slide, please. And now we dive into our community designation themes. So we'll look across rural, suburban, and urban communities to see how their themes may or may not differ a little. Next slide, please. So one rural approach that we saw repeatedly was this idea of connecting nature and destinations through trail networks. So this links community assets, especially here in the land of 10,000 lakes, allowing the community to access those lakes through non-motorized forms of transportation. So the Dakota County Collaborative, for example, is looking to identify trail corridors in the community that link not just the community, but also local and regional trails to these parks and natural features. Belle Plaine is continuing to, again, create those non-motorized links, especially to offer recreation and community enrichment activities in shoreland areas near the Minnesota River. And St. Francis is looking to do the same thing near the Rum River. Next slide, please. So one example of a theme we saw in suburban communities was actually looking at those alternative funding streams. So we talked a little bit about park dedication fees, a theme we saw across organizations, across levels and communities. But one thing we saw specifically in suburban communities, was looking at how else they can gather those funds to make sure that they can create recreation opportunities. So Stillwater in particular is looking for park land dedication or cash in lieu of that land dedication. Shakopee is looking to leverage public-private partnerships, specifically through an Adopt a Trail program, perhaps an extension of their existing Adopt a Park program. And then Chanhassen is looking at volunteer support to make sure that other people are really committing to their recreation opportunities and are engaging in different ways. Next slide, please. And our one urban approach that we saw that felt important to highlight was their responsiveness to demographic changes. So they're hoping to change, they're looking at ways of making sure they're changing their parks and recreation systems to listen to and meet the needs of diverse and diversifying populations. So Brooklyn Center, for example, is going to continue using citizen surveys as well as interviews, while Minneapolis is really aiming to improve not only the programming, but also the design of parks to serve a changing population. And Lauderdale is continuing to adapt parks and open space programming to reflect the demands and needs of the residents that live there through, again, online surveys of their residents. Next slide, please. And to round out our discussion of recreation opportunities, again, we wanted to list some of the equity work that we saw happening in these communities. And there are a lot of them here, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to talk about all of them with you right now, but if you have questions about them, we're happy to discuss. One thing we saw a lot was considering equity beyond spatial barriers. So not just where parks are located, but also the languages that parks communicate in, as well as any financial barriers that may exist. And then looking at those barriers and dismantling them so that people are able to participate. Another important area of equity consideration we saw was ADA compliance in recreational facilities. So making sure that people of all abilities are able to enjoy the recreation, and involving diverse groups in recreation planning so that the same voices aren't being heard over and over again. Connected back to ADA, we saw a lot of communities also trying to incorporate design standards, and as well as creating new and more inclusive recreation opportunities, and aiming for cultural diversity in the recreation they're creating or continuing. Next slide, please. And so to return to these questions that have been posed to you a few times now, we'd love to open up our discussion. I forgot to mention in the beginning, Doug Benton, who Jerome and Eric also introduced, is here, and we are going to be shoving all of the difficult questions over to him because he has some of our other memos open about other indicators if you're interested in those. Of course, we're also happy to talk about the indicators that we discussed today. But I think with that, we'll open it up for questions now.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks, everyone. So we've been asked questions, and I think you'd probably consider other questions that we might have, but anybody want to jump in? Judy, did you raise your hand?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I find this really interesting, and I don't know if you said you went through every comp plan, because that's a lot of pages of stuff to read. But I would say, and maybe Plymouth is an outlier, but it doesn't feel like it when I talk with city colleagues and have spent time in city communities and at the League of Cities and Metro Cities. But you know, the funding strategies by park dedication fees in lieu of land, those aren't new. Those have been around for quite some time. That's how a lot of the communities, especially I would say the suburban communities, the growing communities, if they enacted those strategies early on, were able to build out the robust park systems and trails that they have. So how do you differentiate some communities from others when some of these strategies seem to be best practices and not necessarily cutting edge or leading edge?
Yeah, that we definitely saw. Oh, sorry, Matthew. We definitely saw. I think, for example, we mentioned Lauderdale, perhaps did theirs and had their park dedication stuff written in 2003, and we certainly saw a lot of communities discuss a focus, I would say, on the dedication fees as opposed to like the land, because these areas in the urban core are already so built up. That was something we saw in a lot of plans, and you're right, we absolutely did not read all of the plans. That would have been a lot of reading to do. But yeah, I think it had been interesting when we were doing this to look at how the communities were discussing like this impediment, this barrier of having land already developed, and how they might work around that with focusing perhaps more on trails and connection as opposed to creating new parks. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but hopefully Matthew will get it.
Well,
yeah, no.
I just want to say, that's good information. I appreciate that. I'm just trying to understand, what makes it special, because in some communities, it's just a best practice that actually has been shared within the city communities. When somebody figures something out, we share it all with each other. So I love that you're doing this. I'm just trying to understand how it stands out. I would just add, and the council probably knows this too, especially if they've been in local government, cities often get nailed when it comes to the fees that they charge, because the development community pushes back on that. And certainly when it's a housing development, it adds to the costs, right? So then affordability is pushed up against. So it's great for one and maybe not so great for the other. So I don't know if it shows up somewhere else when you talk about affordable housing. So the great things we're doing to preserve parks and land might be seen as a detriment in some other areas around equity as well.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And to add on to what Anna was saying, we weren't always necessarily looking for like innovative or cutting edge things like that. Like sometimes, we wanted to make sure to highlight those best practices that you were just talking about. And I think that parkland dedication and fees is a really good example of making sure to highlight those best practices, because it's not all about like what is the new and sexy thing. Sometimes this is about what has been working for 40 years and are we continuing to make sure that it works. And that's some of the work we were wanting to highlight as well. And I appreciate you making sure that we're recognizing that difference and noting like what is new and like can serve as a model for like new ways to approach this, and what has been done in the past that we know works and we should continue to model and work at and build with.
Another thing I will add is that there was a lot of overlap in our analysis between indicators like green space preservation and enhancement and the recreation indicator and multimodal trails. So there was a lot of strategies and certain themes that maybe got picked up more in our analysis of green space preservation. They're particularly seeing a lot of use of different forms of like combinations of density transfer, like incentives, direct public acquisition of lands and right-of-ways, and other regulatory zoning strategies together to preserve green space. But the recreation one kind of went beyond that to look at forms of like recreation programming and things like that. So that may be in some ways more of a limitation or overlap and oversight of parts of the analysis as well. So.
Linnea, you have your hand up.
I was going to ask, it's always helpful when we do this if we can see the questions so we make sure we're doing our job. So I was wondering if you could slide those into the chat so that we could see them and be responsive in a helpful way.
Helpful. Here are the questions. What other themes do you see in your work with different communities that you do not see here? What opportunities or challenges do you see with implementing these themes? And how might these themes influence future planning processes? And I'm assuming, since some of this isn't a requirement in plans, that you're suggesting this might be a guidance for our next 10 years. Why, one of the reasons we're thinking about it here today. Any other council member thoughts?
Chair, I do have my hand up now with an actual.
Oh, lovely. I gotta keep focusing on that hand. There you go. Go ahead,
Trying
Lynette.
to use the tools provided to us. So I definitely, I think that all these things are valuable, and I think the idea of bringing aspiration to the communities that we represent around how we can work together, and in a way that builds capacity and meets our communities where they're at is really important. We can't treat every community with a one-size-fits-all expectation. And we need to build resources that are right-sized for the different populations we're supporting so that we can not just have aspirations, but we're able to reach those aspirations. So it's not so much, I think that's the piece about for future planning, we need to really be thoughtful about what's the technical assistance we can provide to implement that planning. On the question of maybe things that are opportunities or challenges, I think there's two things that I've been talking with staff about for the last 2 years and that I still see. One is through our comp planning process is having ways of really monitoring and setting base level for habitat reduction that contributes to climate change, as well as resiliency, and really making sure that we are providing that information to our region so we know how we're doing. Another report just came out recently about the connection and significant connection between the destruction or the conversion of wetlands to carbon. And we just have a real opportunity to be, I really hope we can be leaders in this and not continue to wait. So that's one thing that we have the opportunity to do. And it's so hard for really small communities to be able to monitor, track, and think about those things. So to have us as a resource to do that for and on behalf of small communities and put together the larger picture for the metropolitan area and be able to communicate our health, if you will, in maintaining the different types of biodiversity we need to not only be resilient, but to not contribute to further advancing climate change is important. The other thing I think is very similar. It's helping our communities understand their demographics, helping ourselves as council members understand the demographics that are changing in our communities. The population under 18 looks completely different than the population over 18 in our metro area. And that reaches every small community and large community the same. And so making sure that we are, as planners, really thinking and aware of that information as a part of the comp plan process. And what are we doing? How are we doing in that space? I also think is really important. And as we talk about health, we know that the determinants, the social determinants for health are compounded by issues of race, ethnicity, poverty, and that is something that we need to really be mindful of. It's not a colorblind, those aren't colorblind issues in our institutions. Thank you.
Really great points. And Linnea, when you're saying loss of wetlands, you could also think about all the farmland we have in the metro. It's loss of just farmland, which is I heard is a theme to track.
Chair, if I could, that study talked about the conversion of wetlands to farmlands as being a major contributor to carbon increase.
Oh,
so
thank you.
So I think we need to be knowledgeable about these things, and the data is coming out about this stuff at such a pace, it's hard to keep up on.
Great point. Thank you for clarifying that. And thank you also for the chat comment, Matt. Councilmember Vento, you have your hand up. And you may be on mute.
I'll defer to Councilmember Wolf first, because I think her hand up was up prior to mine.
Sure. Okay. Go ahead, Councilmember Wolf. Then Sue.
I would have been fine letting Sue go first. I better lower my hand here before I forget. So I guess one of the things that I think is missing here, we're talking about things that aren't required in plans, and I'm not advocating to add more requirements because it's already a very long, very expensive process. And our cities are so varied across the region that what is meaningful to one is not necessarily meaningful to another. And I don't want to create more burdens on communities, but looking at what people are doing and talking about in their comprehensive plans is probably not a very efficient way to do it. Asking every city to answer a online survey or something saying, what are you doing this or not, and how, would probably create more meaningful information that can be generalized across the region than looking at whether somebody tried to talk about it in their comp plan or not. Because I think about things like CSA distribution points and whatnot. That's pretty normal around my district, but it's something that's done by businesses, not by government. So they wouldn't necessarily talk about that in a comp plan anyway. Or the farmers market, Lakeville and Farmington and Apple Valley and many of the cities have farmers markets, or some just have people sitting by the side of the road selling stuff from their farm, not a part of a farmer's market. That's not a function of the city. The city didn't create a farmer's market. So some of the questions don't really make sense to me in terms of, is that something that we're getting useful information? Because it's only whether they decided to talk about it in their comp plan, and if they decided to talk about it in their comp plan, it either was or is foreseen to be a problem. But for places that aren't having a problem with it, that things are just working fine, they're not necessarily going to talk about it. So there's a lot of missing information there from my perception.
Helpful insight. Thank you, Wendy. Sue.
I have found this really interesting, and while I understand that it may or may not become a part of a regular comp plan question, I think the value of looking at this information and helping communities and townships realize the benefits of looking at this either in a formal or informal manner is important. I grew up in a small town, and despite the fact that it was a small town, there were four grocers. And while they competed against each other, they worked together a lot to make sure that they were helping to address the food issues in that small community. And they worked really well together. And to the extent that the industries are working together on this, I think it's really important. So what we can do to help generate the conversation, I think, is important. There's one area that I'm really concerned about, and I think it has a thread through a lot of our work, and that's mental health. And to the extent that at some point we as a council perhaps can have a committee conversation about mental health and its impact on our work, I think it would be really beneficial. I think of it from a public safety standpoint. I think about it from a community development planning standpoint. Where are we going to put future housing? How are communities going to react? How can we create conversations that help us all have a more genuine engagement process to avoid the way that mental health becomes a part of those conversations. How mental health affects transit in our region. All of it, I think, is just really important. I don't know that it has to be a formal part of our comp plans, but I do think it needs to be a part of our conversation as a council. And recently, the Ramsey County League of Local Governments has been focusing its work on mental health, and I have found it especially beneficial in terms of understanding the challenges that counties and cities are facing, and school districts are facing in all that they do. So thanks for letting me opine here a bit. I don't know that I provided a whole lot of direction, but I think it's worth considering. Thanks.
No, that's a very valuable theme. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Let's see. I gotta look. Philip, Councilmember Sterner.
Okay, thank you, Chair Sally. Yeah, I just was going to make some comments, and a lot of the comments I can agree with. I like the presentation. These are really in the core of my values of healthy food and healthy exercise and having a play experience for people of all ages and really working on a trail system. But one specific thing I was going to kind of address is by like having these comp plans in every city, what I'm noticing is an oversaturation of like farmers markets, for example. So I was involved in farmer markets for about 3 years with some local farmers selling organic produce, and I worked in Scott and Dakota and Hennepin County. But sometimes these markets are so small that there's no density to go to, and then it's really it's a loss for the farmers, time in that. And so what happens is sometimes items are picked, and it's another place where there's food waste in that. And what I'm seeing, and I've seen different studies, but up from a third to 45% of food is wasted today. And I'd like us to maybe kind of look at those type of things, like partnering, with restaurants or having less regulations where food can be given to others if it's day old or come off shelves. But it's just atrocious all the food that gets wasted. And I'd like to see if there's a way we can address that, either with not requiring a farmer's market in every community or adding, less regulation and getting food out to people that would use it or that type of thing. So, but yeah, thank you for the information. Really appreciate it.
Great, thanks. Robert, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. And let me apologize to my colleagues and to our presenters. My phone has just been blowing up. I got some urgent stuff from my day job going on, but I did get to see the full food access presentation, and I looked at all the slides as well. And I'm so glad we're having this presentation on the project. And in my day job, we have concerns about food access, food sovereignty. We operate a farmer's market. We are opening an urban farm. We have a vision of a bricks and mortar retail shop as well. And then I just want to bring this up because it was a year ago right now where food sources throughout the community I work in, my organization is in the Phillips area, and so many of the food sources were interrupted. And we have an art gallery, which we quickly converted into a pop-up food shelf and sort of grocery store, and we're helping to feed and provision the whole community around us. But it really gave me some real-world experience around resiliency and food access equity, and so it's an area that I'm actually very interested in. And Councilmember Stern, it's great to hear about your experience and background. And I want to get to a couple of specific things. I get to the responses to the questions. But first, I mean, to Councilmember Wolf's point, I think it's a good one. How is comp planning a good way to create incentives? It's more like programming, sort of food programming that would support greater access. greater health, and things in government, as we know, need to appear in a plan, right? If it's not in a plan, it's not going to be funded. And comp planning is a way that we can offer access into any kind of programming that we might base on food access in an even way across the metropolitan area. And so I would think that, you know, comp planning might be the one tool to help create incentives for local communities to access some programming and some resources that we might dedicate to food access. But to answer the questions, and there was something like, here, I think I have them up. So what do I not, what themes do I not see represented, or what are different in the communities? And one of them has to do with sort of local culture, right, and individual culture. And in the Native community, the sort of food sovereignty movement is huge nationally, or really in indigenous communities internationally. Food was interrupting access to traditional food sources and systems was an effective tool of colonization. And so finding our ways back to these traditional foods, traditional methods, and to the concept of food sovereignty is a huge movement. And that's just in the Native community. And I know other communities, equity communities, have cultural centers around food. And so I don't really see that reflected here. It's more sort of about sort of general or generic access. And so that's one thing. Another, and there were some comments about urban agriculture and very local production. And just from the work that I do in my day job, there's so much alignment between state, federal resources to emphasize urban, suburban agriculture. And so there's sort of that, thinking about that made me think about sort of where's the resource piece in all of this, and how would we use Metropolitan Council, maybe the planning process, but to create this sort of resource toolkit, because I can only imagine that this access to resources will grow, at least in the predictable future. And the other piece, and it kind of starts coming up when you talk about equity themes, when you talk about the connection between income and access to food, but also sort of income, jobs, and local production, local distribution of food is an economic development tool as well. And again, there may be resources at some time that we would program to address that sort of income inequity, then how it relates to the issues of food access, food production, healthier food. And so I think it behooves us in government these days to figure out how to sort of combine approaches and to leverage resources and interests across sort of a sector like the food production, food access sector. And so I think there's a strong jobs element here, an economic development element that I think we should be lifting up. Thank you.
Great comments. Thank you, Councilmember. Riva, see your hand.
Yeah, I like the emphasis on recreation and health, and looking at health, maybe expanding that a bit to health equity, which gets to a lot of, it gets to a more holistic viewpoint rather than just focusing in on food. And that also allows each city to decide what's important to them in terms of what they have and what they don't have. So just wanting to express my support for emphasizing both of those two things. And the note about getting access to recreation is really important. I mean, we have systems of renting scooters now and bicycles and ways to track them, coupled with information on how to get to the trails either by paper map or online map. So just glad that we're having this conversation, and looking at what else we can focus on going forward over the next 10 years.
Totally true. Thank you, Rita. Any other thoughts? Well, I certainly think these are two really important subject areas, and just following up on Riva's comment, when we discuss access, it's not lost on any of us that we're actually in the transportation planning and transit operations, how we think of access all the time and proximities and how thoughtful approaches and is part of needs to be part of our Met Council DNA. Any other council member thoughts? Well, I just want to thank Anna and Matt, Doug, Angela, Eric, Jerome, others. Do you, and certainly Doug, do you want to end any kind of last comments since you have our undivided attention?
I could maybe
No.
say
Mr.
something
Chair,
really quick. No, go for it.
just
Go.
quickly, some of the
Go,
comments
Judy.
that are in the chat are just very, very good. They're kind of answering the council members' points that were raised. But do we need to actually like bring those up so people, if they're watching the video, or is the chat available afterwards for people? I mean, you know how normally it's just technical stuff in the chat. These are really good points. So I'm reading them, and I just feel like staff should feel free to mention them verbally if it's appropriate.
Or send them out. And Doug, since you just left this last one, maybe you could just expound on that thought because I was just reading it myself.
Sure, yeah. Since we heard a lot of comments about, maybe the connection to or absence of resilience in some of the content that we shared in these particular indicators, I did wanted to share that we did do a separate analysis of a subset of plans that included like a resilience section or chapter to see how they incorporated resilience in their plans. And when Robert very well brought up that like food and resilience, especially in the past year, what we saw is incredibly connected and important. And in our resilience review, we did find pretty notable absence of the connection between resilience and food in the comprehensive plans, at least. And so we do have a presentation, I believe, recorded of those findings from that, which I believe we can share with anyone who's interested. And that was just a subset of about 31 comp plans, and used a slightly different set of methods to review, particularly the language that was used in connection to resilience, which is kind of a very amorphous term in a lot of planning and development spaces. So yeah. And Matthew dropped the link to that in the chat. And for anyone who's maybe unable to access the chat, we could share that a different way as well. So, thanks.
Thanks, Doug. And right, the connection of food and resilience. And there's a YouTube kind of link. So we got to make sure that at least council members and maybe in the public that at Judy's point, we have access to this chat data. I know Councilmember Lee, you have a thought.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, this was an excellent presentation. So thanks for that. This made me wonder how we could improve or encourage more enrollment in our agricultural preserve program, because I know that that's not very well utilized for whatever reason. And then it made me think about I live in St. Paul, and driving around to the public housing projects throughout St. Paul, you see the beautiful little gardens that the tenants are allowed to have on the public housing projects, and it makes sense because a lot of the tenants are the new refugees, like Hmong folks and Karen folks and people from Africa, who we many of us are like the hillbillies of Asia or wherever we came from. And so subsistence farming is important to our culture and background. And so it makes me think of our own properties at the Met Council where we have public or subsidized housing, how we might be able to be creative and do something similar and allow tenants or community folks like maybe Urban Roots to do similarly, maybe to rent out our lands to do subsistence farming or projects like that. Thank you.
Great thought. Thanks, Chai. All right, here's we have a moment. Any thoughts, questions? Any parties? Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Chair Zelli. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for attending this meeting, and I wanted to emphasize that we, the research assistants analyzed 11 indicators, so they only focused on 2 tonight. But there's more that they can more information we can share with you after this meeting, of reports and other documentation that we'd be happy to share after this meeting. Thank you.
And that point has been made that we really got to take it to heart. There's a pretty robust amount of studies, and we're seeing 2 out of the 11, and so really appreciate that you dove a little deeper in these areas.
Mr.
Judy.
Chair, just one last comment from me. As a member now of the EAC, will they get an opportunity to see parts of this report as well? I think they would really be very much drawn to it and have some insights as well, even though it's talking about comp plans and things like that. They're really familiar, I think, with that side of our work too, and some of the things that you're trying to raise here. So I don't know, I just want to always be an advocate for, their voice and eyes and ears on things that we're working on when it relates to equity, and especially some of these very topics. I think they're timely.
It's good information. Should be shared, right? Okay, not hearing any more comments. I don't think this is the end of the discussion, and you've certainly piqued our interest in really substantive work. So I just really want to thank the team. This is wonderful to have that before us, and I'm glad we could take the time. And I'd always suggest some of the other areas that and some of the other audiences, as Judy suggests, that will value this work. So with that, the evening is cooling off. The sun's still out, so hopefully you can enjoy your afternoon. Appreciate seeing everybody. Appreciate this work, and we certainly see you soon. I think this meeting is adjourned. Thanks, everyone.